Kia ora koutou. Ka mihi aho kia koutou kua tae mai ki tēnei wā tapu, ki tēnei wahi tapu, ki te kimi I te kanohi o te atua. Greetings to you who have come to this sacred and holy place to seek the face of God. When I was praying in my room this afternoon, feeling really nervous about sharing with you tonight, God said to me, they're not coming to see you, they're coming to find me. And so my hope is that I would point you to our Lord and our King as I speak tonight. But as a precaution, I've also borrowed Luke Painter's antiperspirant because I'm quite nervous still. So most of you have met my husband, Paul, and you will know that Paul is the life of the party when you get to know him. And so last year we were out with some friends having dinner, and Paul obviously decided that we weren't quite hitting the mark in terms of entertainment. And so Paul decided that we needed to play a little game. And the game was that we had to partner up, and we had to find out something fun that happened in the city that each of us were born in that year. And so I was partnered up with my friend Angie, and she was born in 1982 in Auckland. Fun fact, the first warehouse was opened in Auckland in 1982. Paul, my husband, he's from Scotland. He was born in Elgin. And when you Google what happened in Elgin in 1984, rather than some search facts, you just get a range of beautiful whiskies as images. And then we went around the group, and Angie didn't have a phone actually, so she did mine last. And my heart did this little flip as she did it. Because when you Google what happened in Colombo in 1984, the first hit is a bombing in a hotel, and the second hit is a list of massacres. You see, I was born in Colombo, Sri Lanka in 1984, near the beginning of a civil war. My parents had already fled the country in 1983, just as the war kicked off, and they travelled to different parts of the world trying to gain residence. And there was some options for them to apply for asylum, but they were really afraid of, placing their hands in a government potentially for years, not knowing what their status would be, and then actually potentially being declined and deported back to Sri Lanka. And so when they got pregnant with me, they made the difficult choice to return to Sri Lanka for me to be born, and then applied to various other places, and eventually was sponsored to come here to Aotearoa, and we arrived here just after my first birthday. I'm ethnically Tamil. My family homestead is in the north of Sri Lanka, and that's the part of Sri Lanka that has been the most affected by the war. And so my entire life, I have grieved for my homeland. I've watched from afar as it's been destroyed by war, decades of war. I've had extended family be threatened, be imprisoned, be tortured, been forced into exile because they spoke out against the government or spoke out against the separatists. I've watched the video footage of far too many suicide bombings, one of which nearly killed and physically maimed my uncle. There was a tsunami that killed tens of thousands of people. I've read reports about the disappearances of tens of thousands of people, about the hundreds of thousands of people that have been internally displaced. Another bombing, this time religiously motivated. Watch the plight of Sri Lankan refugees being unfairly detained in Australia. And then just over recent months, I've watched it economically unravel due to the nepotism and corruption of those in power. I've observed this destruction and this suffering from the relative safety of Aotearoa. And instead here I've had this very different and very privileged exilic experience. The neighbourhood that we arrived to in Tamaki Makaurau in 1985 was still primarily fair-skinned. And the church that we went to, we were the only people of colour. And everyone was so welcoming. Okay, so everyone was really hospitable and wonderful to us, but we were still different. And then my parents just, they'd had enough of the political undercurrents that there were in the Sri Lankan diaspora here in Auckland, at least at that time. And so we didn't really connect to our culture either in the same way. And so all that time I knew that we were different. And then my parents' green card to go to America came through that they'd applied for while they were still in Sri Lanka. So we moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is middle of nowhere, right? And then after a couple of years living there, my parents realized that actually Aotearoa was the better choice. So we moved back here. And I lived in Timaru for a short while. Some Cantabrians here. But the thing was that there weren't that many Sri Lankan kids with an American accent at my primary school. And so I really knew that I didn't belong there. And then we moved back to Auckland. We moved to Mount Roskill, which was increasingly diverse. I even went to a high school where people who had some kind of British or European whakapapa were the minority. But there was never a space where I was the majority. And I always felt like I didn't quite belong. In my early 20s, there was this ongoing narrative still of who am I? Where do I belong? When I finished university, I went traveling the world. I lived in America and then I lived in India. And over again, people were confused by the color of my skin, by my accent, by my inability to speak their language despite looking the same as them. And so when I came back to New Zealand, I just had enough. And so in my early 20s, I got a tattoo, my one and only tattoo of a kiwi. It's on my shoulder blade. Because I really wanted to mark my identity and say, this is where I belong. I didn't want to be in exile any longer. Nearly 3 years ago, my body shut down on me. We were on holiday in July of 2020 when I started to get some weird pins and needles go through my body. And slowly my muscles began to ache and I started to feel weak and I had these electric shocks traveling down my arm. And sometimes I was just so overwhelmed with pain that my body I couldn't move at all. And there wasn't just this physical loss. There was this grief and suffering as I faced the sense of loss of who I was. Pinned to my bed in pain in the night, my baby was crying and I couldn't get up for her. And when I started some of the medications that I needed just to be a bit more able to do things, I had to wean her instantly. But she still wanted to feed and she screamed because she couldn't understand. And I cried too. Physical touch was really hard for me because it really hurt. And I'd lost a lot of my strength, so I couldn't pick up and hold my kids. And I spent so much time in bed. And so I found myself wondering, what kind of a mother am I? I didn't contribute much around the house during that time, and my husband's primary love language is acts of service. And then just with all the physical things that were going on, I had some incontinence issues, so physical intimacy with my husband was not a go, no-go zone. And so I just found myself wondering, what kind of a spouse am I? And then there was the church plant we were leading. I couldn't climb the steps to the altar. I couldn't stand behind the altar. I couldn't lift the cup. I couldn't lift the bread. What kind of a priest am I? When the pain was overwhelming, I would forget my best friends' names. And as someone who was used to being efficient, having high capacity, and let's just say suffers from pride, it was a very humbling experience. I like to be in control and to stick to the plan. And so who was I when all these roles were taken away from me? It's been a painful, disorienting, bewildering experience. And whether it's geographical or whether it's metaphorical, we're all going to have these experiences. Many of us have had these experiences of being in the wilderness or in exile. because all of us will experience grief or loss or suffering or weakness at some point in our lives. And in these times when we're just terribly disoriented, disillusioned, desolate, alone, powerless, and vulnerable, we begin to question our identity. They are the places and the circumstances where what we are made of, what we were made for, and who we are made by are put to the test. Now, so far I've just shared some of my personal experiences, but I just want to touch briefly as well on what we've been describing as our cultural moment in the West. In our cluster last year, us and I'm sure some of you read Mark Sayers' A Non-Anxious Presence, where he talks about how after, just getting the words there, after a long period of stability for the church in the West, for societies in the West, there's suddenly this disorienting instability and change. Words like grey zone, exile, wilderness are used. And the book has a lot of good things to say. It's worth a read. But at the same time in our cluster, we had helpful voices like Sue, who had recently moved from South Africa, and a male who'd come to New Zealand from Pakistan. And they reminded us that feeling of instability, of exile, of wilderness, that's been the reality for the majority world throughout this time. War, famine, natural disasters, persecution, political unrest, economic catastrophe are the norm for the majority of our world. If you've been watching those Lenten study videos, you will have seen the very diverse and sometimes really devastating experiences of the global church. Over the last month, parts of Aotearoa have had some of these experiences in the wake of Cyclone Gabrielle. And so 1 Peter is a letter that at one time may have been to a small group of Jesus followers, but in our times it is a letter for the global church. I just realized we didn't actually do the reading in advance. So if it's on my screen though, so I'm just going to read it out to you before I continue. So this is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. I, Peter, am an apostle on assignment by Jesus, the Messiah, writing to exiles scattered to the four winds. Not one is missing, not one forgotten. God the Father has his eye on each of you and has determined by the work of the Spirit to keep you obedient through the sacrifice of Jesus. May everything good from God be yours. Praise be to God praise to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. The day is coming when you'll have it all, life healed and whole. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. Amen. And so Eugene Peterson's Message version translates verse 1 as to the exiles scattered to the four winds, to the exiles scattered to ngā hau e whā. And then Peter's letter continues, not one is missing, not one forgotten. God the Father has his eye on each of you. When I first became ill in 2020, no one in my faith community suggested that I should stop leading or contributing because of my health. Yes, there was grace for me to step back and do less as I was able to. But what those closest offered me was the nurture and support that enabled me to continue in ministry and to offer what I could despite my illness. Jenny and Justin would come and sit with Ailey so that I could have an afternoon nap. My friend Judy would do my dishes while I lay on the couch. Both Paul and my sets of parents would spend They moved their lives and came to Whanganui so that they could support us doing ministry during that time, and they still do. And because they enabled us to continue in ministry, I had the opportunity to record one of the sermons for our Dio live stream. Now, the passage that I was given was the baptism of Jesus. Our wonderful friend Duncan recorded me. For those of you who don't know Duncan, he served our diocese as our communications guru with incredible grace whilst battling cancer. And while we were setting up for the recording, he shared with me that he had spent the afternoon lying on the floor, fatigued and in pain. And I'd spent the afternoon in bed, saving up enough energy so that I could sit on a chair for 20 minutes to speak. And for both of us, the story of Jesus' baptism was hugely affirming. God's words to Jesus are, "You are my son, whom I love. I take great delight in you." And the words are so remarkable, right? Because they come before Jesus has done anything spectacular. In fact, his life until now has been completely unremarkable. Jesus is from a small, ridiculed village, part of an oppressed people, in a forgotten part of the Roman Empire. And yet here is God saying, "You are my child, whom I love. I take great delight in you." The words that God speaks over Jesus are the same that God speaks over us. "You are my child, whom I love. I take great delight in you." God doesn't care about how much we've accomplished, whether we come from the right family or part of town or ethnic group. The Son of God was a nobody as far as the world was concerned. And here is God saying those words over him. And we know that Jesus claims this identity right before he goes into his own wilderness and exile experience, where he's offered all the things that we so desperately long for when we are in that same place. When we are having those experiences, we desperately long for comfort, for power and control. And Jesus has to decide, is being God's child enough? Is being God's child enough? When I got that tattoo on my shoulder, I totally missed the mark. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know whose I was. Because before anything else, I am a child of God. God loves me and God takes great delight in me. And that's not to say that my ethnicity or my culture or all the other things that make up who I am don't matter. Of course they do. But they come second to my first identity as God's child. It's the identity that tells me that I am enough because I am a daughter of God. And as I sat there speaking to the camera operated by Duncan, we were being reminded that our roles, our productivity are not what counts. No matter what, we are beloved. We are not forgotten. God has his eye on each of us. But this is the clincher for me in those opening lines from St. Peter. God the Father has his eye on each of you and has determined by the work of the Spirit to keep you obedient through the sacrifice of Jesus. May everything good from God be yours. Obedience isn't something we often enjoy talking about, but it is the work of the Spirit in our lives, holding us firm in our baptismal identity and empowering us to be obedient. Jesus was able to be obedient, even death on a cross, because he knew who he was and whose he was. And that life that Jesus lived after he was baptized wasn't about himself. It wasn't even about those he was close to. The life that he lived with those who were forgotten, left out, and vulnerable. Scotty articulated so powerfully last night the journey that Jesus took to the cross. That Jesus walked a different path even to death. And it was also that different path that led to his resurrection. 1 Peter goes on to say, because of God's great mercy, we have been birthed into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. The God who is able to bring life out of chaos is able to bring life out of death. And that is what baptism is for us, right? It's dying to self, saying yes to God to bring new life from chaos. And obedience through the Spirit means saying that yes to God over and over and over again. And that's a testimony of the past 3 years for me. That obedience to Jesus, by walking closely with the Spirit, has allowed the power and grace of God to flourish and to bring new life. Just as I started becoming unwell in 2020, the church plant that Paul and myself and a whole bunch of others had poured everything into over the last couple of years hit a real low point. There was a Sunday where Paul was preaching to a room of 9 adults. And so we had this crucial conversation. Maybe we missed the mark. Maybe this is the point at which we throw in the towel. And we felt like when we prayed about it, God was saying, no, my Spirit has led you here. And this is what you've been asked to do, to replant this church. And then I started to get sicker. And I had this conversation with God again. I was like, are you kidding me? This is getting harder. This is not getting better. And then I was hospitalized. And the following Sunday, I felt like God said, you still got to go to church. You still got to show up. And so I sat in an armchair at the back of church. I was using a Zimmer frame to be able to get around. And I wasn't really able to do much other than talk to a few people, and that was exhausting. But there was this new family that showed up. And then the next week, there was this new couple that showed up, and that first family came back, and it kept happening. And so when Paul and I were at our weakest point, the Spirit of God was faithfully at work and up to something. The next year, we gained some new team members, and within the first term, 3/4 of them all came down with some pretty debilitating and significant health crises. And yet, over that year, the church grew. Now, I know numbers are not everything, but to give you a picture, between that low point in July 2020 and July 2021, our church grew to about 100 people. Many of those newbies have become essential members of our life together, and they've never known me healed and whole. But each of us has been held by the Spirit in a growing community of believers seeking wholeness and healing for one another. And I say that because those closest to me are the ones that have continued to encourage me and hold out hope for miraculous healing. And I think that holding out that hope is also an act of obedience. To hold hope to see the coming kingdom of God even now. As twisted as it sounds, there's some comfort, right, in retreating to my identity as a person with a chronic illness or a disability. There's a reason that Jesus had to ask the man at the pool of Siloam, do you want to be healed? Over and over again, for 3 years, my friends have prayed for me, whether gathered or scattered. I've met so many of you who I'm so grateful for that have prayed for me without really knowing me at all. And over time, with the aid of a lot of different medications mainly actually, I moved from a Zimmer frame to a crutch in order to walk better. But all those prayers, that faithfulness, last year at our Urban Vision Hui, 2 years into my illness, people prayed in earnest for my body to be healed. And the first couple of times it was just individuals that prayed for me. And the result was that my left arm, where I experienced the greatest pain, would burn. But there was no change. And so the last night that we were gathered, we tried a bit of a, we're going to call it a power circle. And these dear friends just began praying for me. And they prayed and prayed for such a long time. And as they prayed, parts of my body burned, muscles would spasm, but I just didn't feel like I had been made well. And yet, as they prayed, I heard this whisper from God that said, I needed to give up my crutch. And so when my friends finished praying for me, I gave it a go. And I walked back to my room, very haltingly, slowly. If you saw me, I probably looked like I was heavily intoxicated. And I eventually got there. But then slowly and surely over the next few days, my walking got better and better. And I still walk slowly, but I'm increasingly able to walk freely. And it's a testimony to the power and grace of God at work. Yet God didn't heal my whole body. For whatever reasons, the part of me that experiences the greatest pain, the greatest confusion, the greatest fatigue, they have not been healed yet. I still don't have a complete diagnosis. And actually, the last couple of weeks have held some of the lowest points in this entire journey for me. So I'm speaking to myself, and I'm writing this message and I'm talking to myself at the same time. When we were in lockdown in 2020, Paul and I compiled some liturgy to use over Zoom for our morning and evening prayers. And we borrowed some words from John Bailey, a Scottish theologian. And they say, if we have suffered any disappointment or defeat, if there has been any sorrow where we had hoped for joy, or sickness where we had looked for health, give us grace to remember that this is not our home. And on our regular Zoom rotation, this prayer has been a frequent reminder to me that in this lifetime we are exiles of another kind. That our primary identity as God's children means that we are not yet home. We're citizens of heaven. That means all of us are longing for a homeland that we have not yet seen. But that longing for a homeland doesn't make us unfaithful, right? It makes us pray all the more earnestly, may your kingdom come on earth as in heaven. We're in exile. We're in the wilderness. But as followers of Christ, we've seen how to do that journey well because of Jesus and because of all the saints that have gone before us and all the saints around the world who encourage us. We're to remember that we are God's chosen, God's beloved children, and to offer what we have, no matter how small, to see the kingdom of God come. Because it's then in our obedience and faithfulness that God's power and grace is seen most powerfully.